a U shape with senior leaders who all want to have their voices heard, and rightfully so. We want to elicit the depth and breadth of their experience and their leadership. And so what we found is that the conversation was too big. We want to put that into more of a bite-sized perspective. So this year at the JETC conference, we'll be doing the same exercise, and I'll explain why that is in a few slides in the future. But we're going to be doing essentially a replay of the scenario, the new magic seismic zone earthquake scenario. That was the basis and the backdrop of the exercise. We'll be doing that again, but breaking out the participants into smaller groups so we can have rich discussions, get everyone's voices heard, and more importantly, not miss any key information or inputs that will drive the after-action report. One thing that you'll find, or that I have found in owning a company that focuses on data, is a lot of bias in the data. And so you have 85 participants. That data point might tell you, oh, well, you got 85 different perspectives. Well, that's not true. We weren't able to get 85 different perspectives because of the way that the exercise was set up. So this year, we're taking a new approach, breaking it out with a lot of help from various partners from the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Northern Command, SAME, and the community to put that together. So I'm really looking forward to that and more to follow on the details. Again, it was recovery mission area focus, and that was deliberate and important because we tend to do these exercises over and over again, focus on the response mission area, which I like to think is more the shiny object. People like to focus on the response, and I think that's in part because that's what CNN covers. It's what most people see. But recovery is long. Right now, I'm in New Orleans, actually, following this presentation. I'm presenting at Distributech, and New Orleans is still recovering from Katrina, and that was 2005. So from my perspective, we need to have more emphasis, more training, more education around recovery, and how do we get engaged on that, and so we don't put all our eggs into the response bucket. Similarly, one of the innovations on the legal side is the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018 that was signed into law by President Trump. One of the things that the law emphasizes is more from the disaster relief fund on mitigation, rather than waiting for the disaster to happen and those DRF or disaster relief funds being available post-disaster for mitigation. It's putting that up front. The old saying goes that $1 invested in mitigation saves $4 in consequence or potential risk. And actually, I think we're underestimating the value of mitigation. For example, FM Global, who is a reinsurer, a large insurance agency, not made up of adjusters, but of engineers, which I think is unique, and I think this audience can certainly appreciate that. They stated on stage back at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce last year, I saw Catherine Kalowski, she's vice president at FM Global. She said that their clients get a $104 return on $1 investment. That is incredible return on investment. I think we need more emphasis, more education, lifting the narrative of mitigation, as well as recovery. But I think when we look at emergency management, the point is there's more to this problem than just responding and putting wet stuff on the red stuff, putting out fires. It's more than putting out fires. It's ensuring that we stay deliberate, iterative, and take very intentional approaches to how we plan, train, and exercise, not just for responses. And you'll find that the Shake and Fury exercise, which I'll talk a little bit more in future slides during this presentation, is very response-centric. And again, I think that's a mistake when we invest. If you calculate the time and energy that goes into developing these exercises with if you're familiar with DoD parlance, a joint exercise life cycle, or a JELC, we spent 18, possibly more months on investing time, sweat, and energy and equity, both personal, professional, and financial equity, into building these exercises and being response-focused and not having more emphasis on recovery, I think is a mistake. And I think we're going to see more focus on mitigation and recovery, particularly from the leadership at FEMA, Administrator Long, Deputy Administrator Dan Kanuski. They're out in the public talking more about mitigation and recovery. Not to say that the previous leadership from FEMA hasn't, but I think given these advances in statute with the Disaster Recovery Reform Act, more can be done, and you're going to see more of that. And you'll notice too, if you attend JETC, and I hope you do, and I hope you're at the TTEX this year on New Madrid. It's going to be a great event. The focus is really going to be on recovery, and we're going to make sure that through our artful facilitation that we keep people there. And I think if you are going to attend, I would implore you, or strongly recommend, that you read the National Disaster Recovery Framework. When President Obama signed PPD 8, Presidential Policy Directive 8, which is national preparedness, that policy outlined 5 mission areas with 5 frameworks and 5 federal interagency operational plans: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. And the doctrine that was the rainfall from that presidential policy was the NDRF, the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It established 6 recovery support functions. One of them is infrastructure systems. And for the purpose of this exercise, we really honed on the infrastructure systems recovery support function. In fact, one of our helpful co-facilitators was one of the disaster recovery coordinators from FEMA, from Region 7, which is out of Kansas City, and that's where the exercise was hosted. She stood up and explained how the recovery support functions lay out, who's involved, who's in lead, who's supporting. The Army Corps of Engineers is the lead federal agency for infrastructure systems. The Department of Energy, where I came from, is one of the supporting agencies, which makes sense, energy being a clear and obvious nexus to infrastructure systems in long-term recovery. And certainly in a New Madrid seismic zone, where you have 8 states, 4 FEMA regions, with huge local impacts, but massive global systemic impact to economies. You talk about at the epicenter, based on the study that FEMA and Department of Homeland Security conducted back in 2011, in lead up of a different exercise, a national level exercise in 2011. The epicenter was in Marked Tree, Arkansas. And the impact from the epicenter at Marked Tree, Arkansas, would be felt east of Boston, north to all the way up to Canada, and west to Colorado. That's a really large geographical area. And we have historical evidence in the 1800s. The New Madrid seismic zone erupted, and it was felt in Boston then. It will be felt in Boston the next time, I'm sure, depending on the magnitude, certainly. Obviously, if it's a 4.0, much different than an 8.0. But this is going to be much different than the 1800s. Similar to space weather, we saw a massive shutdown of the telegraphic system last time we had a massive solar event. Today is different than the early 1900s or the mid-1800s. We have really interconnected, interdependent, hyper-interconnected infrastructure systems when you're talking the Internet of Things, the infrastructure of things, or Internet of Things. We have smart cities, smart sensors, remote sensing. There is a lot more that goes into today's society than there is from an infrastructure perspective and what allows us to live our daily lives. And that requires more study. And what was elicited in the exercise during the discussion is we really don't know what we don't know. And we are on this brink of new technologies and big data and the ability to harness all of that data and cross-correlate it, understand where the pain points are, understand where the actual hurt is going to be so we can be better planned, better trained, exercise against those plans, make sure we're deliberate and iterative, improving on those, making the investments in infrastructure. For those who watched the State of the Union address, there was a lot of discussion on infrastructure. It gets talked about over and over and over again, and I would like Congress to act on this and to get on the President's desk and it to be signed, a big infrastructure bill to fix a lot of these issues. And it's not just germane to a new seismic or New Madrid seismic zone. We have the Cascadia subduction zone. We have a Hayward fault. We have San Andreas fault. I'd point you to Dr. Lucy Jones. She gives a great, unfortunately, nightmarish scenario of the waterway system that traverses the San Andreas fault line in Los Angeles. Think about Los Angeles County and the city being completely cut off from water for potentially months on end. I can't even imagine crisis scenario, but we have to start imagining it. And just like what was illustrated in the 9/11 report, some of that failure of imagination, led us to potentially a really bad day. And I think we should be looking to history and learning and reflecting from previous events that may not necessarily have a direct connection. How does an earthquake and 9/11 connect? But certainly that failure of imagination, we have to have more imaginative planning, looking at the data, digging into it, ripping out the biases, and so that we can actually understand or have a better understanding, higher fidelity on the situation before we enter this scenario, because it's going to be a really bad day. And the dying piece of it, I think there's going to be less immediate death from these types of events. You look at California and all of the investments that they've made in hardening infrastructure, bridges, roads, tunnels, what have you. I think the long-term systemic health impacts are going to be more seen. Similar to in Puerto Rico, the epicurve, swung up very quickly when folks couldn't get access to things like insulin. And we didn't have a good grasp in Puerto Rico, I felt, on understanding the systemic risk that impacts on the island had to other supply chains. And you're going to see this here. FedEx headquarters is located in Memphis, Tennessee, is going to be shut down, at least at their headquarters level. Who knows for how long? That needs more study. And how does that one impact to one supply chain asset owner and operator impact the others? How does the impact to Kansas City Light? How does the impact to Memphis Light and Power? All these companies who are going to be directly impacted, not necessarily ubiquitously, there will be varying levels and degrees of impact, but understanding when the scenario changes and you have aftershocks and unpredictability, providing a little more assurance and confidence to understand what those impacts are so we can make those investments and ensure that we have a future that allows us to be more resilient and not sustain the type of risks and impacts and consequences that stem from those risks and the hazards that pose them in the future. And it's not getting any better as it relates to the climate either. So from a changing climate, that only adds to the layers of complexity. And if you look at the World Economic Forum and the UN, they're forecasting for 2019, of the top 5 risks, 3 of them are natural hazard, potential disaster causing, the usual suspects, wind, flooding, earthquakes, fires, the devastating fires out west. So this is a global issue. It requires a global dedication to addressing these challenges, not just on climate, but disaster risks overall. And I believe that SAME is well positioned to be part of that community, or more even part of that community, and elevating your narrative and your voices to be heard, because in many ways this is an engineering problem. These are systems of systems. They're highly interdependent, highly interactive, and require engineers to really study these things hard and look at them and understand where we can reduce risk from a mitigation perspective. We look at the exercise, beyond infrastructure systems, things that I talked about already: planning, operational coordination, logistics, supply chain management. All of that is really important to the overall dynamic of planning and understanding the risk to this type of scenario. And what I would like to see in the exercise is less people getting focused, what I like to call admiring the problem, and moving from problem admiration to problem solving, and thinking about this beyond the immediate impact of the consequence of the new major event. Thinking about this of, how do we reduce risk to disasters in general across all hazards? Emergency management has always been an all hazards business, and it should maintain that ethos. I think that's really important because there are core capabilities. If you look at FEMA's doctrine, there are 32 core capabilities that traverse all mission areas. One of those cross-cutting core capabilities is planning. We're always going to do planning in the prevention, in the protection mission areas. We're always going to be doing planning in mitigation, coming from the military background, certainly nuclear power, it's all about the procedures, heavy emphasis on the procedure. It's hard to leave that community and not think that way, sort of in the systems, the planning, being deliberate about the approach, and having that type of discipline, which is why I always appreciate the engineering community and certainly SAME. I think you could be more helpful in providing your voice into that conversation because it's an important one and it's one that we need to have more of. This is a probable earthquake. It's likely to happen. It did happen, just like the Cascadia event. Japan has on record from 1700, in their written text on the impact of the tsunami in Japan from the Cascadia event. And there is some interesting study in the Pacific Northwest of understanding topography and geology and how things have shifted and changed and how they can see today impacts from 1700. This is a probable event. San Andreas is probable, Hayward's probable, Cascadia, New Madrid, these are all probable things. And since we know they're going to happen, we can at least start to derive some insight so we can plan against some level of assumption and have some high confidence in assumption by using all of this available data to us to interpret that, to understand what we need to do through all phases: response, recovery, mitigation, and planning for the next one that will be also inevitable. You look at the damage, at least from what's estimated for the purpose of the exercise, and as we like to say in the exercise, don't fight the exercise. But this was based on a DHS study. These weren't numbers that we came up with out of our own, fairy dust bag. We took this from good analysis that DHS had done, a number of years ago, but very recently, 130 hospitals, 3,500 bridges, and 450,000 leaks or breaks to interstate pipes. That is an enormous challenge, enormous feat. When you think of all the complexity and the third, second order consequence from those breaks, the downstream effects from those breaks. So you talk about oil and natural gas, both crude and refined liquid products. Where are we going to make up the delta in the supply that run through those pipes? I'll give an example. Hurricane Harvey, then Hurricane Irma, major impacts to Texas and to Louisiana from a refining, from a production perspective at the wellhead, and the Colonial Pipeline being one example. The Colonial Pipeline is really important to states like South Carolina. In certain cases, 60 to 70% of their petroleum consumption comes from the Colonial Pipeline alone. And so we had some previous perspective on this when in 2016 I was serving on the National Security Council at the White House, and the Colonial Pipeline went down because of a break, one single break on line 1, which is the line that transports their liquid petroleum refined product all the way up to states like New Jersey and New York. So, coming from the wellhead and refining out in the coast of Texas or in Texas, moving that to compressor stations and pumping stations all the way up across the southeast and the northeast to serve customers throughout, where it's transported to fuel farms or to trucking operations and then moved to points of distribution where folks can buy stuff, at the pump and what have you. That one line break caused potential supply shortages throughout the Southeast, and so we had to do things like initiate waivers. And we didn't have all the states on the call at the time in 2016, and so we reached out to the National Association of State Energy Officials, and we started to reach into the various departments of energy and the utility commissions and the regulators at the state level so that we could waive things like environmental waivers and driving waivers like hours of service and overweight and tolls and things like that, where we can expedite the movement of trucks across multiple state lines. And you're going to see this in a new magic seismic zone type event. You're going to have this massive influx, or desire influx anyways. There might not be the massive influx because of all the damage to transportation networks and nodes, but you're going to have all this desire to move trucks and tankers and everything else into the affected area. And that's going to require effort, a coordinated effort across multiple states to move all of those assets through them, because you can't just drive through the state. And when you drive through the state, that's going to take time, especially you have to pull into the toll station or into the weigh station or whatever it may be. And all of that time adds up, and the thing that you'll never get back in a disaster is time. And since time is always of the essence, you're going to want to be pushing these things as quickly as possible as soon as you can get it. And the thing that we learned from the Colonial Pipeline incident helped us in Harvey, when we were able to get all the states on the call and quickly expedite the issuance of those waivers so that we can move things like utility crews and the trucks in the unaffected states. So when we think about the New Madrid scenario, we can't just think of the immediate impact. And if you read the after-action report that we submitted to FEMA, it talks about it. It talks about, we have to look at this event just like we're going to have to look at the Cascadia event from the perspective of not just the immediate impact, but the global impact. Next slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture, just to showcase. Oh, sorry. So you saw General Semonite. No worries. We don't have to go backwards. Just showing that we had very senior leadership at the exercise. They're very interested in this problem, and of course, if anybody that knows General Semonite, he's the master of disasters, which is an interesting silver lining. No one wants to find themselves in crisis, but if you're in this business, it's good to have folks like him who are a veteran of these challenges. I just wanted to highlight quickly the objectives. Really quickly, I'm not going to read through all of them, but I wanted to illustrate them for your purposes. Just click next. Next. Thank you. So here are the 4 objectives. Sorry, you advanced too quickly. Mind just going back one? No worries. For those interested in the objectives, there we go. So here are the objectives. Just wanted to give you an opportunity to read through them. But if you look at it real quickly, we want to talk about authorities, responsibilities, command and control issues, who's leading what and what are we leading, and how do we integrate public and private entities into really what's going to be a mixed challenge, or a mixed command and hierarchy challenge, just like in Puerto Rico when we were architecting the restoration of the grid, and the FEMA administrator said, hey, General Semonite, we were briefing General Semonite, myself, and a number of others from the interagency were briefing Brock, the FEMA administrator, and he said, Todd, I want you to go and fix Puerto Rico's grid. And he saluted the flag and moved forward smartly. And when they put us in the room, we had to figure out how to do it. And yes, the Corps, as was argued by Assistant Administrator Jeff Dorco, another former 2-star Major General, he's like, we did this in Baghdad, we can restore the grid, and we found that it wasn't as easy as restoring the grid in Baghdad. A war campaign is much different than an island response from a domestic perspective. So because we didn't plan for that, again, going back to the deliberate plans, we didn't have all the kinks in the armor ironed out, and we need to be more deliberate, because in a New Madrid with 8 states, 4 regions, hundreds of utilities, there's going to be this similar challenge, and I don't think it will be appropriate, in my personal opinion, to have the Corps architect that response. I think it has to be more integrated with clear unity of command, unity of effort, and understanding where that goes. Similar analog that could possibly be reflected. Another bad day, Deepwater Horizon. The Coast Guard and EPA have this thing called the National Contingency Plan, where there is lead delegation to the in this case the Commandant of the Coast Guard, but there's unity of command and unity of effort from industry and the responsible party and in the state to lead that effort. And I think we're going to have to see this. I know we're going to have to see this if we're going to do it effective in New Madrid. Whole of nation approach, right? This is going to take everybody. So talk to the 3rd objective, and then we want to identify ways that we can further engage with industry. Again, industry is going to be largely affected. and is going to be largely the solution provider. We have to figure out, where FEMA is going to be in charge of a lot of things or in support of the state. We have to figure out how does industry support and how do we support industry. Next slide. So here's some of the findings. I'll just go through them quickly. A lot of stuff that I already talked about. Response-oriented thinking must evolve. This is a culture gap. As I mentioned earlier, everyone likes to be focused on the response. We need to change that culture. And if you look at the FEMA strategy, the strategic goals for that was established last year, in 2017. No, 2018, the strategic plan was released. It talks about culture preparedness. We need to change the culture so we move beyond the response and we think about the whole of preparedness across the entire ecosystem. Connection between response and recovery not well understood. When's the handoff? When do we do that? When is there an overlap? Sort of the Venn diagram, response and recovery. And how do we, in our deliberate response plans, articulate and set the stage for successful recovery, I think is really important. We need to determine all the different funding needs. I think it's very clear. We had the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for example, in the room talking about USDA contributions, DOT, Department of Transportation, talking about their contributions. I remember from the 2016 hurricanes, the 2016 flooding in Baton Rouge, one of the key sticking points was core funding for existing construction projects and reconstruction projects dating all the way back to Katrina, as well as highway transportation funds, and how we could remove some encumbrance from or remove some impediments to the states accessing those funds to be eligible for the floods in 2016. We're going to have to quickly determine now in blue skies, hopefully before we get to gray or black skies, that how these funding mechanisms work, how the new laws like the Disaster Recovery Reform Act inform that, and how we can be better postured to ensure that we have all the funding mechanisms to direct it to whomever needs to get the job done in a timely fashion. Improving standby contracts, pre-purchasing, pre-positioning, where we can put assets that we know they're at least at less risk of being impacted from the event so that we can quickly mobilize sort of inside the wire, because there's going to be this dynamic. You're going to have the islanding effect with all this infrastructure damage. There's going to be the inside the wire and the outside the wire. We need to pre-position things to where we can inside the wire so we can quickly mobilize pre-scripted mission assignments, getting those stuff to the survivors, to the impacted, affected entities, so we can reestablish communities and get folks talking to one another, to their loved ones, and connected. Creating better mechanisms for state certified professionals. You can't just send an electrician or a plumber or a doctor or whomever to another state and they can just operate, with no issues. Same thing with international assets. We can't pull folks from Canada or Mexico or from Japan or from wherever, from our allies, to come to the United States and provide search and rescue assets. This is something I worked on at the State Department. We have this thing called the International Assistance System. It's not that easy. When you want a lineman or a crew from Canada, it's not just they show up to the border, show their Nexus badge, and then boom, they're in, and they're putting out poles. There's more to it. So we need better understanding from a state to state and country to country understanding of how do we get certified professionals where there are gaps and needs from an engineering perspective, from a utility perspective, from an architectural perspective, whatever. We need to understand how to facilitate that and get those into the state. Skip the bullet, cross-regional prioritization mechanism across RSFs. Not surprisingly, we create institutions, they create their own silos, and people like to hunker in the silos. We need to do a better job always of breaking down the silos, getting people to talk cross-functionally, and doing that mind meld so we can benefit from the whole. Similar to what I talked about with the 85 participants in the room, we need to figure out how to break that into pieces and parts, so that we can get the focused dialogues, but then bring that back to plenary, or in this case, bring it back to command, to leadership, so we can make decisions in a unified way, make sure that everybody's voice is heard and that are valuable, so we can solve really critical problems. Again, better understanding of the impacts. I already spoke to that, and we really need to build a true common operating picture now, during, and after disaster. Not for attribution, but one disaster, maybe 2012, Hurricane Sandy. I asked for a common operating picture from the Army Corps of Engineers, and they sent me a slide deck. That is not a common operating picture. I need to be able to see who's doing what, where, why, and when, getting information in real time, my company is looking to solve that problem, but most specifically, whoever company is solving the problem, we need to have a common operating picture where we can have a level playing field, shared operating environment, understanding what the problem is, so that we can all work together cross-functionally, cross-sectors, with the data in a timely way, so we can accelerate the time to decision, and we're not late for need. General Jacoby, the past commander of U.S. Northern Command, he'd always say, I don't want to be late for need, can't be late for need. And I think that's really important, and I love that statement, and it carries with me for the rest of my life. And we can't be late for need, because ultimately the survivors are the ones who are going to suffer the most, and we're failing our duty as public servants and in service of the community. Next slide.
Okay. Hey, Sean, we're starting to run short on time. I want to be sure we give people a chance to ask some questions. Could we stop now and maybe open the floor up for some dialogue?
Absolutely. Okay? This is my last slide. Yes, this is my last slide.
So a couple of housekeeping notes that I should have covered before. While the presentations are going on, everybody's put on mute, but you can put questions into the chat dialogue there on your screen. The webinar is being recorded, so it'll be on the website, SAME under the resilience, and there will be PDHs. Those will come out later on, and I can ask Belle if there's any other details. Otherwise, I think she'll just send those out to the web address, to the email addresses that are provided. So with that, you can either send your questions through chat, or you can right-click on your where you've got your microphone, and it'll unmute your line, and you can just ask your question. So let's open the floor up and see if somebody's got some questions.
Yeah, this is Stephen Tayana. I understand a lot of good points came up. First of all, Joe, I really appreciate putting this together. It's very, very important for us to be proactively involved, all of us. I'm in California. He touched a lot of earthquake, and New Madrid is an issue too. We are far behind. For the United States, we're far behind what we're supposed to do. We don't have enough money. Last year, we were $4.6 trillion to fix our infrastructure proactively. We are far behind. Unfortunately, SAME, I'm a member too for 38 years. We are apolitical, but we need all of us individuals to really talk to our legislator to prioritize what is needed best. This is what's happening. I don't know how we can talk about this more, and I really appreciate it. I just want to make a comment about that. I have a lot of questions, but we don't have time right now. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Oh, thank you. Other questions? Well, Sean, I have a question that came up just then. Prioritization. Were there any suggestions that came out of the analysis about how to approach prioritization?
That's a great question. So I would say there wasn't so much, at least from my recollection, discussion on how that prioritization schema would work, but certainly everyone agreed around the table and in the room. There was definitely all consensus that we need to have a prioritization schema in place to do that. So I'll just give you a brief reflection on something that came out of another after-action report on the Hollywood Hills incident, which was a nursing home in Hurricane that got affected by Hurricane Irma. And if you read that report, it was a Senate Judiciary report, really great report. If you read that report, it talks about Florida Power and Light prioritization schema for restoration, for power restoration. That varies. That prioritization schema varies from Dominion, for example. And it's not that either one is bad, but in certain cases they're regulated by the state to have certain prioritization schemas in place. And so we're not going to be able to go one size fits all, state by state, but since this is going to affect these 8 states and possibly beyond the 8 states directly impacted from the physical effects of the earthquake, we're going to have some unity of effort. Maybe SAME can help lead or be a leader on this charge. But given the fact that there's the complexity of state-by-state regulations on prioritization schemas for restoration, and power is just one. You know, water is another sector that's critically important. Communications is another sector that's critically important. So I think what we need to do, what we ought to do, work with FEMA and the federal interagency and state organizations like the National Government Association and really bring this together as a critical point of discussion where we should at least come to some consensus on some baseline concepts and thoughts on what should be a prioritization schema. But definitely, certainly, we need to have this conversation because, again, we don't have a lot of time. We know it's going to happen. But I would point you to that report and look at how they prioritized, the Florida Power and Light prioritized, and look at a company like Dominion or even your own utility in your own backyard. Ask them, how do you prioritize critical infrastructure restoration? Do you put the hospital back on first, or do you put the nuclear power plant back on? And why is that? Well, there are regulations and reasons for why that is. And so we have to unpack and unlayer that onion so that we can understand, okay, what's the regulatory environment? Start there, understand what we're required to do, make any adjustments, and then figure out on the things we're not required to do, what makes sense logically to conduct that prioritization.
So if you'll send me that link, we'll be sure we put it on our website so everybody can access it. I want to ask one more question and a quick answer because I want to move on to the next presenter. From David Dorman. The focus so far has been on natural disasters. Is there the same focus on adversarial attacks, such as on the electric grid? Did y'all do the same thing with the discussions?
So the focus for the discussion during the exercise was certainly New Madrid, which is a natural hazard that implicates a disaster. But if you look at the National Infrastructure Advisory Council power outage study that I was a part of, and we recently briefed out at the White House on the recommendations of that study, one of the topics actually is prioritization. But if you look at it, it's all hazards, agnostic to the hazard or the precipitating event that caused the impact. Taking down the power grid, whether it's an earthquake or whether it's a combined physical cyber attack, they're going to have similar, if not the same, consequences. You lose power. Okay, power is connected, like the arm is connected to the shoulder bone or whatever, like the saying goes. Power is going to go out. That's going to interdependently affect water, wastewater, and other assets or other critical infrastructure sectors. So I think we can go with an entry point of saying, there's going to be some similarities on as far as the consequence and trying to understand how we engineer out risk to the system so that we can harden and make the system better from an all hazard perspective, because otherwise we're just going to be chasing the shiny object. But there are things that we can do on the cyber physical side that can also benefit us on the natural disaster side. So there are mutually reinforcing benefits from reducing risk from cyber from adversaries that want to hit us from a cyber perspective, that will help us, like for example, not suffering a malware attack or a ransomware attack that takes down server where I have access to all my critical data, and then I'm in the middle of a natural disaster and I can't leverage that data to make a decision. So I think we need to be looking at this holistically, but for the purpose of the exercise, no. But certainly the community is looking at this problem from all angles, from all threats and all hazards. And I'd point you to that NIAC study. I'm happy to give the link, and that's very recent. And so, yes, we are certainly looking at this from all of the above perspective.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. We'll move on to the next speaker. And Bill, I thank you for your patience. Our next speaker is Bill Anderson, a Senior Program Officer for the Transportation Research Board of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. At the TRB, he focuses on policy, economic, social issues, and transportation, which includes community sustainability, regional infrastructure resilience, transportation systems operations, and management. Most recently, his committee supported the development of a resilience primer for executives of state departments of transportation, a resilience assessment tool for state transportation agencies, and a 5-year transportation resilience research roadmap, all released in 2019. Between 2008 and 2015, Bill was the Director and Chief Operation Officer for the Infrastructure and Security Partnership, or TISP, which many of you know him from. He was the SAME lead where SAME was the lead benefactor. Bill holds degrees from Roger Williams University and University of Maryland in College Park. Let's welcome Bill Anderson to our webinar today. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you, Bill. Thank you, SAME, for inviting me to present today. I was asked to actually give a presentation on what are some of the challenges that communities are facing in working in this area of resilience. And I want to commend the TIS Board of Directors and the folks for many years within SAME have been working in this particular area and keeping that focus on the infrastructure and regional aspects of resilience, because I think that's where you're still seeing the biggest bang for the dollar that has been spent in these particular areas. And I'll go through this primarily with a focus on transportation sector resilience or transportation systems resilience, and then get into how that relates with the community aspects. And it'll make a little bit more sense of what some of the challenges are facing communities in working collectively or collaboratively around the public and private sector effort or networks, and also across the different lifeline infrastructure sectors. So can I have the next slide, please? Just quickly, what is TRB? The Transportation Research Board is the largest program unit of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Many of you are probably very familiar with the National Academies. The National Academy of Sciences was actually formed around the Civil War through President Lincoln, but TRB came around in 1920, so the same year that SAME was formed, also TRB was formed. So we'll both be celebrating our centennials at the same time, which is going to be a great time for all. Nonetheless, TRB's primary role is to be a convener, also to be a researcher, and to advise the nation. So we don't really advise the government unless we are asked by Congress to do so, but we are an advisor for the nation in general. So next slide, please. I also want to make sure you understand that there are overlapping relationships that we have through our sponsors and SAME's stakeholder base as well, and membership base. And the reason why I wanted to make sure you understand this is just because there is this natural correlation between these two organizations, and the military has been interested with working with TRB. We do have a standing committee on military transportation. Recently, we've begun conversations with the National Defense Transportation Association about supply chain resilience and the impacts that the cybersecurity actually has on that particular network and system. So there's a lot of conversation happening around that, and I'd be happy to rope everybody into this particular conversation here. So if you're interested about where our basic funding actually comes from, the majority of our funding, over half of it, really comes from the state DOTs directly. Other pieces are through our sponsors, but also through our convening efforts, like our annual meeting, which brings 14,000 people together every year here in Washington, D.C., with about 20% of those coming from outside the United States as well. Next slide, please. You're all pretty very familiar with the resilience at the academies through the disaster resilience, a national framework that was published in 2012. In that, we defined resilience as an individual, community, and national resilience, the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, respond, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. Since that time, the Resilient American Roundtable, which included the cities of Cedar Rapids of Iowa, Seattle, Washington, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Charleston, South Carolina, as their test beds for the programs and reports and guidance that they were actually developing. They've come out with extra or additional materials that were supplemental or next phases of the disaster resilience imperative document. And those are included within the measures for community resilience for local decision makers and developing a framework for measuring community resilience. So these are particular good materials that will be supportive if you do choose to go down these roads of looking at it from a community resilience perspective, along with your stakeholders within perhaps the communities outside installations, for example, which is a primary place where we could see greater advancement occur within community resilience. And I'll give more information as to why that is, but I think more structure and more guidance would be the biggest leverage in advancing community resilience into other areas that do not include installation heavy or university heavy communities. There have been additional programs that are related through the academies around the resilience subject, including the Gulf Research Program, which was developed after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which is going to really look at the advancement of the sciences and practices and capacity to generate healthy ecosystems, thriving communities, and an offshore energy systems. So there's a newer program that is getting underway around this particular area, and a good place is going to be developing additional resources that might be of interest to you. The Climate Change Initiative is also another place where we are collecting information across the academies as to what is occurring to address climate change. And we send out a monthly newsletter, and if you're interested, all of these are active links. So all you have to do is click on those and it'll take you right to the right place to request the information. Next slide, please. Now, resilience at TRB. We produce at TRB policy studies, we have technical activities, and we also have research projects. And these are across many different disciplines. It's not just within the modes of transportation, but we look at the engineering, we look at asset management, risk assessment, we take into ecology, sustainability, we look at telecommunications and other communication networks. We're even looking further into the future with automation. And all of this is really the subjects of sustainability and resilience. So next slide, please. What I want you to get you a little bit more familiar with are the different divisions that you may find of using resource from. So we have within the technical activities division of TRB 220 committees. As I mentioned, there are a lot of committees, and a number of those actually take up the topic of resilience. But we have one specific section, a collection of committees, that focus on the topic of transportation systems resilience. And they are looking at specifically things like infrastructure protection, disaster logistics, evacuation management, recovery, and so on and so forth, as you see listed in front of you. This section has had in the past year many accomplishments. They like to show this off with a briefing they put together every single year. But this past year, they held a conference that was in Denver, in Colorado. It was in October. We had 43 states representing their transportation agencies, and it wasn't just their state DOT. Sometimes it included their airport authorities or their seaport authorities. Sometimes it included their transit agencies as well. So we had a total of 380 attendees, and what we were focusing on in particular at this event was what kind of primer or information should be given to the senior executives of transportation agencies so they know more of what they should be doing today around the topic of resilience and what they should be planning for in the future. And we also then captured some of that future need and are developing a 2020 to 2025 research roadmap so that we have a better sense of what kinds of research needs statements need to be developed and then funded. Additionally, we held an executive task force which talked about the topics of resilience and sustainability, particularly looking at community resilience, funding and finance issues, and a host of other things. And I'll go over some of their findings here momentarily. We also renewed our strategic plans, so we do that every 3 years. And the two most important things that we actually did was establish 2 new subcommittees. One was on the first responders resilience. We're trying to look at workforce issues. We are realizing that many of the first responders, particularly within the EMT and police communities, we're seeing an increase in suicide rates or accidental deaths that could have been preventable. So we're trying to figure out how can you actually identify when a first responder is under stress or dealing with challenges within their home life that may be impacting how they would actually respond, or behave during work. And if we can identify that earlier, then perhaps the supervisors can actually talk to them and give them the support that they need so that they are actually safer on the job and more responsive and more of an excellent responder during the time of need. We also had developed a brand new subcommittee on resilience and sustainability collaboration, and this is primarily to look across all 220 committees to talk about where we're currently looking as need for community and transportation resilience, and what research is actually already underway, what research has already been developed, and how is it working in practice. And we're inviting in as many of the external organizations that we have as stakeholders and partners to participate in this group. So it's more of a collaborative information sharing group, so they can take that information back and work on some of the challenges or common interest areas within their own relationships or organizations or committees. Next slide, please. We also have a Cooperative Research Programs division. In that division, since 2001, CRB has published over 200 resilience-related reports with the funding of more than about $32 million going into that particular effort. And of course, these are across these different particular cooperative research programs. We have one within aviation. The hazmat materials one is not really in effect at this particular time. We have another one in freight cooperative research, transit, highway, and there was also this commercial truck and bus safety synthesis that was developed. That was a one-time effort there. Currently, all of the suite that you see on the slides, 19 of those are actually active projects. The rest of them are completed, besides 5 that were actually canceled. Next slide, please.
Unmuted.
I wanted to show you some of the more recent publication titles. And at the very end of this presentation, there are 2 ways that you can search to find many of these materials or any materials that are related to subjects of your interest. So these were only within the freight and the highway programs. The first one is a synthesis report that came out. And what we did was we looked across all 50 states, with 80% of the states actually reporting, asking them, what are your current resilience programs? How are you conducting risk assessment and vulnerability assessments? How are you relating resilience to your asset management programs? We were asking these types of questions so that we can have a better awareness of what the current practice is. And you'll find many of the answers and responses intriguing, because there are a number of states, I think the majority was over half of the states, that have a resilience program in place, although they don't use a definition for resilience, and then some of those don't even have a risk assessment program for their assets. So that was a particular surprise. And then it also identified some shining stars like Massachusetts, Colorado, and Oregon DOTs, all as good examples of what a resilience program could actually look like within their agencies. I wanted to also highlight the focus that we have many reports coming out around the infrastructure items like bridges and tunnels. You'll see many materials, including a special edition of our TR News, our magazine, coming out on resilience of tunnels. So, and this will include some great stories and case studies from other countries like Australia as well. Keep an eye out on that one. And if you're interested of working again from that tabletop exercise perspective, the final report listed, report 50, this report is a focus on the supply chains, mostly with rail and freight, of course, trucking. What we try to do with this is look at different scenarios at which a supply chain could be disrupted. And we dived a little bit more deeply as to who are the stakeholders and the players within the particular scenario that may be able to implement or adapt to that particular risk and prevent it from happening, or offer up solutions to get it back up and running more quickly. So those are also presented within each of those scenarios. And in this particular opportunity, we tied this in a workshop environment of our annual meeting to a tabletop exercise where we ran through a particular framework for working across community stakeholders to address particular hazards and risks and then work through those particular challenges. So we were using these particular scenarios as those particular challenges in that workshop. So again, this is a nice material to actually help with that whole entire process. Next slide, please. Transportation systems resilience is also worked within many of our partners and other organizations. AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, and we work very closely on developing not only the research projects within the Cooperative Research Program, but also with the reports that are developed by AASHTO. And here's a list of products that have been developed since between 2009, I guess, and today, all of which have been adopted by AASHTO, which means these are the programs which the state DOTs would first consider when moving in these particular subject areas. Now, I'm going to focus here, if you go to the next slide, on the fundamental capabilities of effective all hazards. What we did within this particular report is taken the security and resilience aspects within all of those 200 plus reports that have been produced through the Cooperative Research Program and the reports which AASHTO and TRB worked on together. And we applied it to the different functionalities within a DOT as to how they can be guides, or basically a mapping effort of the functionality from the guide across all of the risk framework or spectrum. So this is a nice particular product. It's the first time that we were able to actually do that and actually do it in an effective way. So the transportation officials within the agencies can take this information, and if they understood what their basic needs were, they knew what particular resource could actually help them with that particular need or fulfill that particular need. We'll continue to probably update this on a regular basis, but we haven't figured out exactly when that next timing would actually be to update with new materials. Next slide, please. Now, I focused a lot as far as the transportation systems of resilience and what we have been doing to produce a lot of materials, but there are still a lot of complexities that remain in this particular area. After all, with that many reports that have been put out there, that much guidance that has been put out, you actually think that our transportation system would be completely resilient. And in many ways, from a national perspective, it is. You can actually see that if one mode is disrupted, that other modes can actually step up and take up the slack. So we are resilient in many different perspectives, but there are those different dimensions that need to be considered, and there are those different scales of impacts that need to be considered. And then there's the other consideration of what are the best adaptation or mitigation solutions so that the transportation system can be even more resilient. So there are still lots of areas where we can increase the resilience of our transportation system, but we're now beginning to start looking at how the scalability or the focus, the locality, the geography is actually taking into effect here. So it's not just the system any longer, but now we really need to look at what is that community need and that regional need. Next slide, please. From a community resilience standpoint, it's very similar to sustainability as how we consider or focus on the different aspects and needs. So it's nice to see that there are programs which are supporting this particular effort. And what I try to capture here is through the economics, the people, and the society itself. But underneath, there are these different aspects of different programs which cut across all three of these. And these are the things which are of interest by the sectors and asked by the sectors for improvements upon so that they can actually reach a greater level of community resilience. And that is where we're seeing the challenges right now up here, is in within these areas. How do they overlap? How do they challenge? How do they affect one of the pillars within the economy versus the society itself? How do they affect the people and their particular presence? I think one of the best examples is when we start looking at the infrastructure resilience piece, we have this concept that infrastructure gracefully fail. So that's a nice idea. But when you start looking at people, people do not gracefully fail. So that's a particular challenge. How you're going to address that particular aspect and element of this. Where do you place your priorities and focus at that particular time of need when infrastructure may be gracefully failing, but people may be depending on it? We can't actually let them gracefully fail with it. So that's the challenge in this particular area. Next slide, area, please. So what we see occurring are the current available tools focusing mostly on providing collaborative networks for people to work together in planning. And we're also challenged by the fact, as our last presenter mentioned, there are rules and laws in place which dictate how certain planning efforts actually take place. So here I'm providing the Nist Community Resilience Planning Guide, which also includes an economic decision support tool as well, or guide, and they overlay how you can take the economic development guide and put that within their 6-step process for a community resilience planning effort. And it works very nicely. And particularly when looking at the federal highways policy and guidances, since they have federal and state laws and local laws that they have to comply with for transportation system-wide planning efforts. Those do not really affect or are negatively impacted by this kind of effort. And then actually, in many cases, they can be supportive elements for conducting these particular community resilience planning processes. So how do we take what is required by law and use that as a planning tool or a way to feed in these resilience concepts or guidances into that process? That's the challenge that needs to be really considered here. And there's the particular opportunity in this particular place as well, since we have so many resources already available within the transportation industry that can actually help with providing additional guidance as to how you can look at that regional system-wide plan. Next slide, please. But the challenge also within transportation is that we first took up the banner of sustainability. A colleague of mine one day told me that this whole effort on moving towards resilience is akin to the effort with the NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, and implementing that within the agencies. So that created new offices, that created new regulations, that created new positions, new assessment tools, new assessors, and new performance measures. There was all kinds of impacts that NEPA actually had within the agency. Similarly, they tried to take that and use that, similarly within sustainability, they tried to use sustainability as a way to reshape the department so that assets, so that people, so that financing and budgets were all aligned together to ensure that the sustainable development is taking into consideration the impact of the resources and the need so that it meets the needs of our future generations. So that same concept is particularly there, and as I said before, it still has that triple bottom line, very similar to what community resilience is building off of right now. But there are particular aspects between those which are of a challenge, since we want some redundancy built in to our infrastructure for resilience purposes, yet sustainability would tell us that that is a waste of resources that has a greater impact on our future, which could be negative. So how do we take that and make sure that the redundancy isn't so much of a redundant system, but more or less as a complementary system that can take up the slack if one of them is disrupted. So those are the particular kinds of things that still need to be worked out. In that same sense, next slide, please. In that same sense is the reason why TRB decided to move forward with exploring what are the relationships between resilience and sustainability by forming an executive task force. And we asked this group of people of about 25 to divide themselves up into 4 working groups. And very quickly, it was a 6-month period, come up with some high strategic recommendations as to what TRB should be actually looking at more closely regarding community resilience, budget and finance resilience, the general subjects between resilience and sustainability, and I can't remember what the 4th one is, I'm sorry. And basically what we were trying to do is take the example of mitigation from the climate change impacts and how that could be a focused discussion, remembering that we are to take consideration all modes, all hazards, and all the time, as in developing these recommendations. What they came up with, particularly with the community resilience, since that really is related to this topic, is 4 sets of recommendations. 1, look at the role in current community resilience and sustainability planning. Transportation seems to be a little bit away from the table when it comes to these particular elements, except for when you're talking about sustainability. There are all kinds of sustainability transportation programs at a community level. We also made a recommendation of looking at the intersection of social science community as the focused on the local engagement. And then there's also this particular need to look at long-term planning and adapting to changing conditions. This is a particular problem. As we go back to that other piece where we're required to conduct regional or statewide transportation plans, we develop these with the basic knowledge of what we would like to see happen within the community development, and that would include from a business or economic perspective, but also a population perspective. So when the design of the road is actually laid out, that is with that in mind, that a set number of businesses may come there, a set number of people may move there. So that is the infrastructure needed to support that. But we can't help when population growth exceeds expectation or when business actually booms. So the design wasn't meant to handle that, but the community will allow it to continue to grow. So how do you actually take that into consideration? That's a particular challenge for the state DOTs and for the community urban DOTs who continually ask the questions, how do we trust our predictive analysis tools that we put out there? That includes from these economic growth perspectives, that includes from the policy analysis, that includes from the environmental impact assessments as well. You know, how do we trust the data that's actually coming out of that so that they can properly predict what they actually should be doing or properly decide what type of mitigation or adaptation measures to take so that an infrastructure is resilient to handle the demand during normal operation, but also demand during a stressed operation. Next slide, please.
Okay, Bill, I need to step in there and see if we can, while we still have a little bit of time, and see if some people have some questions they'd like to ask, because they're going to run out of time on our webinar here.
All right. So let me skip forward. I'll get to the challenges here. The challenges that we're facing, you can turn to this particular report, Building Community Disaster Resilience Through Private Sector Collaboration. That is a link that is active. They lay out these four or these three particular points pretty well in Chapter 4. Governance is a particular issue. How do you make sure that the right set of community members are all included within this conversation? That includes the disadvantaged community. And then how do you trust one another within those conversations? How do you share the best practice or good practice particularly, and ensure that you're developing the right community codes for the right particular reasons? It isn't always because of a safety consideration. And then the data, again, that's a big piece. How can you actually trust that? Next slide. And additionally, besides that, what we have been seeing within the conversations through our convening efforts is that workforce resilience and people resilience within the community resilience aspect is understudied or understood. It's not understood. Another particular piece is reliability and resilience in risk actions. How do you convince the decision makers that they can prioritize and make the appropriate decision? This is a particular problem in transportation because they don't even have a self-assessment tool yet. Even though it will be produced this year, they will be able to see internally the current state of the resilience within their own agencies and look at how they can prioritize that. So it is a step in the right direction, but then they still have to consider the reliability of that information, the trust of that information. Sustainability and resilience is still a particular problem, as I mentioned, and the strategic planning for the future disruptions. We have automation coming in transportation. We already have some of it built in through connectivity. How are we going to work with the energy sector and telecommunications sector, which are essential pieces, so that our connected and automated vehicle network is going to be possible within the same timing that transportation is planning right now. And then cybersecurity, we already have talked to that topic many a times already, and no new information really to share at this particular point. So at this point, I guess I could go ahead and take some questions.
Okay. So any questions from our audience?
From what I saw, Bill, on your presentation, you had a couple of graphs that intersect together. And what I noticed that lack of communication is the worst way to get into more disaster. So you confirm that. Communication is the key, isn't it? And
communication is the key. And I think that the challenge here is now, how can we get the sectors to start sharing their successes and seeing where some of the overlap is occurring? How you get that worked into a community resilience planning process. So again, the trust and reliability that the decisions being made are the right ones.
that's correct.
Okay, so there's a question that came in on the chat line a little earlier from Thomas Felker. He mentioned he's from transportation industry, and he was talking about as a transportation engineer, they're behind the curve on resilience. I was wondering if there's suggestions to sell or educate fellow transportation engineers on designing resilience into systems. That seems to be in the TRB's wheelhouse.
There are many guides that are out there, and they get into the weeds of this particular subject area, including rebar forming within the concrete, what concrete mixes to use, what to watch for within your winter road treatments, and how that works into the cracks, the impacts of that when you have ice freezing during the winter and widening the cracks, and then have a drought in the summer and then a flood to follow. So there's lots of research you actually find that's been conducted around here, and reports that give out some good guidance as to the design for bridges, tunnels, roads, rail lines, And the easiest way to do that is on slide 31 of 32. It offers links to where you see search fields within the TRB website, or TRID, the Transportation Research Information Database. There they include 1.1 or 1.2, sorry, million entries on from around the globe and on reports and studies that are out there within the transportation arena. You use it just like you would Google to find your topics of interest.
Okay. Other questions? There was another question here. Wendy Goldsmith mentioned about this Silver Jackets program, which some of you know about as being a collaboration effort that the federal government puts some funds into. But I'm curious, when you think about transportation and how DOT pulls things together, what do you think about this effort of facilitation? Is this something underutilized? Is it overutilized? Is it a federal role from your perspective there, Bill? I mean,
this is where I have always struggled personally. You know, coming from our experiences with TISP and SAME, we basically said, leave that up to the community. Let them decide what they actually need as a leadership and a structure for that. You know, it could be a group of people, it could be the community as a whole, and how they actually make the decision to make their decisions jointly together. It could actually be led by one individual. And then I put on my transportation hat, where, you know, that was my background before taking that role, and I'm back into it again. And I go back to that requirement that a regional plan has to be done for transportation. And that has a requirement of somebody taking a lead. And it depends on the state who leads that. It could be the state DOTs. It could be a consortium of transportation agencies. It could be an MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization, or they can hire a contractor to do that for them. There's lots of different ways that you can get at that particular effort, but it is an important effort. And it's really taking what we have learned from a planning perspective with our resilience efforts and applying that to the current practices. So working more closely with the MPOs, or within our transportation world, we called it the TISMO or TRISMO, the Regional Transportation System Management and Operations, and work with those organizations and stakeholders to ensure that they are taking the lessons learned and applying them.
Okay, all right. Anybody else got a question?
Joe, I have a question for you. I guess next time, this is a powerful presentation, both Bill and everybody else out there today, Sean, and I think probably a longer time period would have been great. I really thank you for allowing this to happen. I think we should do more communication to Bill Anderson, to yourself and Sean, getting out to the people out there. My challenge has been, I live in California, lived there for a long time. I work for the governor for free and the volunteer disaster service, but I can voice my voice to as a citizen taxpayer and to legislator. We're really short in funding. We all know that, and I think somewhere along the line we need to find out what are the priorities. You mentioned that yourself, Joe asked a question. Prioritization. So how can we find where to put priority on what? Honestly, I think the best thing to do is what would happen if we don't take our infrastructure immediately, because you will become a third world country. It's really bad out there. And one pipeline disaster, one signal goes, what are the opportunity costs of the time? We need to educate people out there, especially our politicians. Like I said, same is apolitical, but I can speak as a citizen and taxpayer to them. I think we need to educate them. I don't know how you feel about that, Bill and Joe.
Well, Stephen, Let me give some help with that.
Got 1 minute.
We have a lot of different materials that are out there, as I said, and if we can actually get the right funding organizations to point towards those, because the majority of those research projects, I should say that again, all of those research projects required 3/4 of the states agreeing to fund that project. So you already had the majority agreeing that it was a need, and that the product, and that's the reason why the product is actually out there. So if we can get those funding organizations to point to them and say, these are some things that you should take in consideration first and fund, that would be extremely helpful. And also answer Dr. Scalangi's question that I see in the chat. TRD is interested in looking at cross-sector research. The challenge is, that's not what our mission is, or our scope is currently able to accommodate, but there are other places where we might be able to work that out. So we're still looking into how we can focus a little bit more on the community or multi-sector aspect, even the multi-jurisdictional aspect within transportation itself, because it comes from the states, it comes from the communities, and each of them have their own authorities.
Last slide, please. I want to thank everybody for your participation today. I especially want to thank our two speakers, Sean and Bill. I think you did a great job. It was very informative. We are out of time. On the screen, you can see the sessions that are scheduled for the JETSI and the resilience track. I encourage you to participate. The DoD panel, we are working very closely with FEMA, in particular the new program, which will move funds from post-disaster into pre-disaster mitigation, which is a program that was appropriated back in the fall of 2018, and we hope to have the deputy administrator be the big part of that panel. But anyway, we're still negotiating because they've been shut down. But anyway, we look forward to seeing you in Tampa, and we look to have another webinar somewhere in the end part of March, early part of April. So thank you very much. I want to thank Belle for organizing and setting up the webinar, and y'all have a great day. Thank you very much.
Joe, can we get a